The blood on Dylan Westbrook's hands was still fresh when he pushed through the glass doors of Meridian and Associates at 11:30 on a Tuesday night. Scarlett Meridian looked up from her case files, her green eyes immediately cataloging the dirt under his fingernails, the torn sleeve of his expensive jacket, and the desperate way he clutched a newspaper to his chest. "They're saying I killed her." His voice cracked on the words. "Victoria's dead, and they think I did it." Scarlett had built her reputation defending the kind of clients other lawyers wouldn't touch. Drug dealers who claimed police brutality, corporate executives caught with blood money, politicians with dead prostitutes in their hotel rooms. But something about this man standing in her doorway made her hesitate. Maybe it was the way his blue eyes held genuine shock instead of the calculated fear she usually saw. Maybe it was how his hands shook as he set the Boston Herald on her desk. The headline screamed across the front page, "Pharmaceutical heiress found dead." Below it, a smaller line read, "Fiancé questioned in Victoria Sterling murder." "Sit down." Scarlett gestured to the leather chair across from her desk. "Start from the beginning." Dylan collapsed into the seat, running his hands through dark hair that looked like he'd been pulling at it for hours. "I came home from a job site around 9. Victoria was supposed to be at her book club, but her car was in the driveway. I found her in the living room." He stopped, swallowing hard. Someone had beaten her to death. Scarlett had seen enough crime scene photos to know that kind of violence was personal, passionate, the type that pointed directly at whoever was closest to the victim. "Did you call 911? "Immediately. But by the time the paramedics arrived, the police were treating me like a suspect instead of a victim. They kept asking about our relationship, whether we'd been fighting, if I knew about her will." Dylan's voice turned bitter. "Apparently, she left everything to me. $200 million I never wanted." The Sterling pharmaceutical fortune was old Boston money, the kind that came with political connections and social obligations. Victoria Sterling had been photographed at charity galas since she was 16, always perfectly composed, always saying the right thing. The idea that someone had killed her in her own home would send shockwaves through the entire Massachusetts elite. "Have you been formally charged?" Scarlett asked. "Not yet. Detective Morrison said they're building their case. But he made it clear I shouldn't leave town." Dylan leaned forward, his intensity filling the space between them. "Ms. Meridian, I know how this looks. The fiancé is always the first suspect. But I loved Victoria. I would never hurt her." Scarlett studied his face, looking for the tells that separated innocent clients from guilty ones. She'd learned to spot the micro-expressions that revealed deception, the nervous habits that indicated rehearsed stories. But Dylan Westbrook's grief appeared genuine, raw in a way that was difficult to fake. "Tell me about your relationship with Victoria. Any problems? Arguments? Financial disagreements?" "We met 2 years ago at a gallery opening in Back Bay. She was looking at a building I designed, and we started talking about architecture." A small smile crossed his face before disappearing. "Victoria wasn't like the other wealthy women I'd met. She actually cared about things. Social justice, environmental causes. She was planning to use her inheritance to start a foundation." "When did you get engaged?" 6 months ago. We were supposed to get married next spring." Dylan's voice dropped. She'd been acting strange lately, though. Nervous. She kept checking her phone, looking over her shoulder. When I asked about it, she said she was just stressed about wedding planning. Scarlett made a note. Nervous behavior before death often indicated the victim knew they were in danger. Did she mention anyone bothering her? Threats? Ex-boyfriends? Nothing specific. But last week, she hired a private security company. Said it was because of some break-ins in the neighborhood, but our area hasn't had any crime reports. Dylan met her eyes. I think someone was threatening her, and now they've killed her. The police need to be investigating that instead of wasting time on me. The office fell silent except for the hum of the heating system. Scarlett had taken cases with less evidence and weaker clients, but something about this one felt different. More complicated. The Sterling family had connections throughout Massachusetts politics and law enforcement. If they wanted Dylan Westbrook to go down for Victoria's murder, they had the influence to make it happen. My retainer is $50,000, she said finally. That gets you through arraignment and initial motions. If this goes to trial, we'll need to discuss additional fees. Dylan reached into his jacket and pulled out a checkbook. Whatever it costs. I just want the truth to come out. As he wrote the check, Scarlett's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at the screen and felt her stomach drop. The message was from Judge Jonathan Cross's clerk. Judge Cross has been assigned to Commonwealth versus Westbrook. Preliminary hearing scheduled for Thursday, 9 a.m. She'd been hoping for any judge except Jonathan Cross. Their professional relationship was complicated enough without adding a murder case to the mix. But there was no avoiding it now. She was about to go head-to-head with the one man who could see right through her courtroom masks. "There's something you should know," she told Dylan as he handed her the check. "Judge Cross will be presiding over your case. He's fair but tough. No sympathy for defendants who waste his time." Dylan nodded. "As long as he's honest, I can live with tough." Scarlett hoped he was right, because in 48 hours, she'd be standing in Jonathan Cross's courtroom, defending a man she was already starting to care about more than she should. Jonathan Cross was already in his chambers reviewing case files when his clerk knocked at 7 a.m. Wednesday morning. "Judge Cross, the Westbrook case just got interesting. Defense counsel is Scarlett Meridian." Jonathan set down his coffee cup without taking a sip. 6 years of maintaining professional distance, and now they'd be locked in a courtroom together for what could be months. "Thank you, Patricia. Please make sure we have adequate security for the preliminary hearing. The media attention will be significant." After Patricia left, Jonathan walked to his window overlooking Willowbrook's courthouse square. The last time he'd seen Scarlett outside of formal proceedings was at the Massachusetts Bar Association dinner 3 months ago. She'd worn a midnight blue dress that matched her eyes when she was angry, which seemed to be her default state around him. They'd exchanged exactly 4 sentences about a mutual colleague's retirement before she'd excused herself to speak with the district attorney. Their history was complicated in ways that had nothing to do with law. When Scarlett had first appeared in his courtroom 6 years ago, defending a domestic violence case, Jonathan had been struck by more than her legal competence. She argued with a passion that suggested personal investment, a fire that made even seasoned prosecutors nervous. After she'd won an acquittal that everyone thought was impossible, Jonathan had done something completely unprofessional. He'd asked her to dinner. "I don't date judges," she'd said, not unkindly. "It's a conflict of interest. Not if we're careful about case assignments," he'd replied, immediately regretting how desperate he sounded. "Judge Cross, I've spent my entire career proving I'm more than a pretty face in an expensive suit. Dating you would undo all of that work." She'd gathered her files. "But I respect you enough to be honest. Even if the ethics weren't an issue, you're not my type." He'd never asked again, but he'd never stopped hoping she might change her mind. Now she was defending a man accused of murdering his fiancée, and Jonathan would have to watch her fight for someone else's freedom while maintaining judicial neutrality. Across town, Scarlett was having her own complicated morning. Dylan had arrived at her office at dawn, looking like he hadn't slept. The stubble on his jaw was heavier, and there were dark circles under his blue eyes that made him look older than 32. "I need to tell you something," he said without preamble. "About my background. It might complicate things." Scarlett poured herself coffee from the machine in her office kitchen. "How complicated?" 8 years ago, I witnessed a crime. A serious one involving organized crime figures. The FBI offered me witness protection in exchange for my testimony." Dylan sat heavily in the same chair he'd occupied the night before. "Dylan Westbrook isn't my real name." Scarlett felt her stomach drop. Witness protection meant federal involvement, sealed records, and a client whose past was largely unknowable. "What's your real name?" "I can't tell you that. Not yet. Agent Rebecca Hayes from the Boston FBI office handles my case. She's the only one who can authorize disclosure of my identity." Dylan ran his hands through his hair. "But I swear to you, whatever I did 8 years ago has nothing to do with Victoria's death." "Dylan, this changes everything. If the prosecution discovers you're in witness protection, they'll argue you're a professional deceiver. Someone comfortable with false identities and elaborate lies." Scarlett set down her coffee cup harder than necessary. "And if they subpoena your federal records, they're sealed. Agent Hayes assured me the protection program would hold even if I was charged with a crime." But Dylan's voice lacked confidence. "Unless you think I should come forward voluntarily." Before Scarlett could answer, her phone rang. The caller ID showed Victoria Sterling's number, which was impossible since Victoria was dead. Scarlett answered anyway. "Ms. Meridian? This is Charlotte Sterling, Victoria's cousin. I found your card in her purse." The woman's voice was shaky. "I think my cousin was being blackmailed." Scarlett put the call on speaker. "What makes you think that?" "Victoria called me Monday night, the day before she died. She was terrified about some photographs. Said someone was threatening to release them unless she paid $50,000. Charlotte's breathing was audible. She asked me to meet her Tuesday evening, but she was already dead by then. Did she say what the photographs showed? Something about her at a party from college. Victoria said they were taken without her consent and would destroy her reputation if they became public. Charlotte paused. She also said she was worried about Dylan's safety, that whoever was blackmailing her might hurt him too. Scarlett met Dylan's eyes across the desk. Charlotte, did Victoria mention who was blackmailing her? No, but she said she recognized the voice on the phone calls. Someone from her past. Charlotte's voice broke slightly. Ms. Meridian, Dylan didn't kill my cousin. Victoria loved him more than anything. She was trying to protect him. After Charlotte hung up, the office fell silent. Scarlett watched Dylan process this information, looking for signs of deception or surprise. His shock appeared genuine, but 8 years of living under a false identity had probably taught him to control his reactions. You didn't know about the blackmail? She asked. Nothing. Victoria never mentioned photographs or threats. Dylan stood and walked to the window. But it explains why she'd been so nervous. Why she hired security. Scarlett made notes on her legal pad. Blackmail provided motive for murder, but it also opened up new suspects. Someone who knew Victoria well enough to have compromising photographs from her college years. Someone whose voice she recognized. We need to contact Agent Hayes immediately, she said. If Victoria's death is connected to your witness protection case, the FBI needs to know. Dylan turned from the window. And if it's not connected? If this is just about the blackmail? Then we find out who had those photographs and whether they killed Victoria to keep her quiet. Scarlett stood. Either way, your preliminary hearing is tomorrow morning. Judge Cross will decide whether there's enough evidence to hold you for trial. The mention of Jonathan's name made Dylan's expression shift. You know Judge Cross personally? We have a professional relationship, Scarlett said carefully. He's fair but demanding. No tolerance for legal games or emotional appeals. What she didn't say was that Jonathan Cross had been in love with her for 6 years, and tomorrow morning she'd have to stand in his courtroom defending a man she was already starting to trust. The kind of trust that felt dangerously close to something deeper. The Willowbrook Federal Courthouse was packed by 8:30 Thursday morning. News vans lined the street, and reporters pressed against the security barriers, shouting questions at anyone in a suit. Scarlett had entered through the back entrance to avoid the circus, but she could feel the weight of public attention pressing against the building's walls. Judge Jonathan Cross's courtroom was standing room only. Scarlett took her place at the defense table, acutely aware of Jonathan's presence on the bench even though he hadn't entered yet. Dylan sat beside her in a navy suit that made his blue eyes more prominent. He'd shaved and looked more composed than he had in days, but she could feel the tension radiating from him. All rise. The Honorable Judge Jonathan Cross presiding. The bailiff's voice cut through the murmur of conversation. Jonathan entered wearing his black robes, his salt and pepper hair perfectly combed, wire-rimmed glasses catching the courtroom lights. He moved with the controlled authority that had made him one of Massachusetts's most respected judges. When his eyes briefly met Scarlett's, she felt the familiar jolt of attraction she'd been fighting for 6 years. Please be seated. We're here for the preliminary hearing in Commonwealth versus Dylan Westbrook. Jonathan's voice carried easily through the courtroom. Counselors, please state your appearances. Assistant District Attorney Michael Torres stood first. Michael Torres for the Commonwealth, Your Honor. Scarlett rose. Scarlett Meridian representing the defendant, Your Honor. Jonathan's expression remained neutral, but Scarlett caught the slight tightening around his eyes. Mr. Torres, you may present the Commonwealth's evidence. Torres was competent but unimaginative, the kind of prosecutor who relied on overwhelming evidence rather than courtroom brilliance. He methodically presented the case against Dylan, the defendant found alone with the victim's body, no signs of forced entry, the victim's substantial inheritance going to the defendant, and most damaging, Dylan's fingerprints on the murder weapon, a crystal paperweight from Victoria's desk. The defendant claimed he touched the paperweight while checking for a pulse, Torres continued. But forensic evidence suggests the victim died from repeated blows to the head. No reasonable person would handle a bloody murder weapon while checking for vital signs. Scarlett made notes, but her attention kept drifting to Jonathan. He listened with the focused intensity that had first attracted her to him, asking clarifying questions that showed he grasped every nuance of the evidence. When Torres finished, Jonathan's gaze shifted to her. "Ms. Meridian, does the defense wish to present evidence at this hearing?" "We do, Your Honor." Scarlett stood, feeling the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with high-stakes litigation. The Commonwealth's timeline ignores critical evidence that someone else had motive to kill Victoria Sterling. She called Charlotte Sterling as her first witness. Victoria's cousin testified about the blackmail calls, the compromising photographs, and Victoria's fear for Dylan's safety. Under Scarlett's questioning, Charlotte painted a picture of a woman terrified by threats from her past. Did Victoria ever mention receiving money to pay these demands? Scarlett asked. She said she was liquidating some investments. $50,000 in cash. Charlotte twisted her hands in her lap. She was supposed to make the payment Tuesday night, the same night she was killed. Torres's cross-examination was predictably aggressive, but Charlotte held firm. The blackmail calls were real, the threats were escalating, and Victoria had been planning to pay rather than involve police. During the lunch recess, Scarlett found Dylan in the hallway outside the courtroom. They walked to a small conference room the court had provided for attorney-client consultations. "How do you think it's going?" Dylan asked once they were alone. "Better than I expected. The blackmail evidence gives us reasonable doubt." Scarlett set her files on the table. "But Torres is going to argue that you killed Victoria to prevent her from paying the blackmailer, that you couldn't afford to lose her inheritance." Dylan moved closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne mixed with nervous sweat. "Scarlett, there's something else you need to know. About why I'm in witness protection." The way he said her name made her stomach flutter in a way that was completely inappropriate for an attorney-client relationship. "What is it?" 8 years ago, I witnessed a murder. But it wasn't random crime. It was a federal agent who'd been investigating pharmaceutical companies for money laundering. Dylan's voice dropped. The agent's name was Thomas Meridian. Scarlett felt the room tilt. "That's impossible. Agent Hayes showed me his file when I entered protection. Thomas Meridian was investigating Sterling Pharmaceuticals for using their international operations to launder money for organized crime. He was killed 3 days before he was supposed to testify to a federal grand jury." The conference room suddenly felt too small. Scarlett gripped the edge of the table, her mind racing through implications she didn't want to consider. "My father died in a car accident. Single-vehicle crash on Route 95. The FBI classified it as a targeted assassination, made to look like an accident." Dylan's voice was gentle but relentless. "Agent Hayes said he left behind a daughter who became a criminal defense attorney." Scarlett stared at him, feeling 12 years of carefully constructed beliefs crumbling. Her father had been a federal agent working insurance fraud cases. Boring, routine investigations that had never put him in danger. She'd been told he fell asleep at the wheel driving home from a long shift. "You're saying my father was murdered because he was investigating the Sterling family?" "I'm saying the man who killed your father is probably the same man who's trying to frame me for Victoria's murder." Dylan reached for her hand, but she pulled back. "Scarlett, this isn't a coincidence. You taking my case, Victoria being killed just as the statute of limitations was about to expire on your father's investigation. Someone is tying up loose ends." The door opened and Jonathan appeared. He stopped when he saw them standing close together, his expression shifting from professional concern to something harder to define. "Ms. Meridian, is everything all right? You look pale." Scarlett forced herself to focus. "We're fine, Your Honor. Just reviewing testimony for this afternoon." Jonathan's gaze moved between them, and Scarlett realized how intimate their conversation must have appeared. Dylan standing close enough to touch her, the emotional intensity visible on both their faces. "Court resumes in 15 minutes. Jonathan said carefully. "I trust you'll be ready to proceed." After he left, Dylan stepped closer again. "Scarlett, I know this is overwhelming, but if I'm right, if your father's death is connected to this case, then you're in danger too." She wanted to deny it, to insist that her father's death had been a tragic accident and that Dylan was seeing connections that didn't exist. But the timing was too perfect, the coincidences too numerous. Someone had killed her father to protect the Sterling family secrets, and now that same someone had killed Victoria Sterling. The question was whether they'd kill Scarlett Meridian to keep those secrets buried forever. "We go back into court, and we win this hearing. she said finally. Then we find out who's been murdering federal agents and pharmaceutical heiresses. Dylan nodded, but his expression remained troubled. And if Judge Cross figures out there's something personal between us? Scarlett met his eyes, feeling the pull of attraction mixed with professional duty and newfound grief. Then we hope he's professional enough to separate his feelings from his judicial responsibilities. What she didn't say was that she was no longer sure she could do the same. That evening, Scarlett sat in her office with 3 boxes of documents Agent Rebecca Hayes had delivered after the hearing. The FBI agent was a composed woman in her 40s with sharp eyes that missed nothing. She'd made it clear that Dylan's witness protection status was non-negotiable, regardless of the murder charges. Your client testified against Vincent Torino, head of the Torino crime family, Agent Hayes had explained. His testimony led to 47 federal convictions. The moment his real identity becomes public, he's a dead man. Now Scarlett was alone with files that painted a picture she'd never wanted to see. Her father's investigation into Sterling Pharmaceuticals had uncovered a sophisticated money laundering operation. The company's European subsidiaries were processing payments for the Torino family, cleaning millions in drug money through legitimate pharmaceutical transactions. Thomas Meridian had been 3 days from presenting evidence to a federal grand jury when his car had veered off Route 95 at 70 miles per hour. The Massachusetts State Police had found no skid marks, no evidence of mechanical failure. Just a federal agent who'd supposedly fallen asleep and died instantly when his car hit a concrete barrier. Scarlett's phone buzzed with a text from Dylan. "Can we meet?" Found something in Victoria's apartment the police missed. 20 minutes later, she was standing in Victoria's Back Bay brownstone, a crime scene that had been released back to the family. Dylan had a key because he'd been living there part-time before the wedding. The living room where Victoria had died was spotless now, all traces of violence removed by professional cleaners. The police searched everywhere obvious, Dylan said, leading her upstairs to Victoria's home office. But they didn't know about this. He pressed a hidden panel in Victoria's antique desk, revealing a compartment containing a flash drive and a stack of photographs. The photos showed a younger Victoria at what appeared to be college parties, but nothing that seemed worth blackmail. The flash drive, however, contained something much more damaging. Financial records, Scarlett said, scrolling through the files on Victoria's laptop. Sterling Pharmaceuticals' European operations going back 5 years. The numbers told a clear story. Money flowing in from companies that existed only on paper, processed through legitimate pharmaceutical sales, then transferred to accounts in Switzerland and the Cayman Islands. The amounts were staggering. Over $200 million in the past 3 years alone. Victoria figured it out, Dylan said, reading over her shoulder. She was building a case against her own family. Scarlett felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air seeping through the old windows. This is exactly what my father was investigating 12 years ago. The same pattern, the same shell companies. Which means whoever killed your father is still running the operation. Dylan's voice was grim. And they killed Victoria because she was about to expose everything. A sound from downstairs made them both freeze. Footsteps on the hardwood floors, slow and deliberate. Dylan moved to the window and looked down at the street. There's a black sedan parked across the street. Wasn't there when we arrived. He closed the laptop and pocketed the flash drive. We need to leave. Now. They slipped out through Victoria's back garden, cutting through the alley that connected to Newberry Street. Scarlett's heart was racing, but not just from fear. Dylan had taken her hand as they moved through the shadows, and even now, walking quickly toward her car, he hadn't let go. "My apartment isn't safe," he said as they reached her BMW. "If they know we were at Victoria's place. You can stay at my house in Brookline." The words were out before Scarlett could consider the implications. Having her client sleep in her guest room crossed every professional boundary she'd established in 15 years of practice. Dylan stopped walking. "Scarlett, I can't keep putting you in danger. Maybe I should just tell Agent Hayes I want to disappear again. New identity, new location. Running won't solve this." Victoria tried to handle it alone and ended up dead. Scarlett turned to face him, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. "Besides, they killed my father. This isn't just your fight anymore." The drive to Brookline was tense, both of them checking mirrors for signs of pursuit. Scarlett's house was a modest colonial she'd bought after making partner, located on a quiet street lined with maple trees. She'd chosen it because it felt safe, a refuge from the violence and chaos of her professional life. "Guest room is upstairs, second door on the right," she said as they entered through the garage. "I'll make coffee, and we can go through Victoria's files properly." But as she moved toward the kitchen, Dylan caught her arm. "Scarlett, wait." She turned, and suddenly he was kissing her. Not the careful, professional kiss of someone testing boundaries, but the desperate kiss of a man who thought he might die before getting another chance. Scarlett knew she should pull away, should remind him about attorney-client privilege and professional ethics. Instead, she kissed him back. When they broke apart, she was breathing hard. "Dylan, we can't." This is exactly what Judge Cross was worried about. "Judge Cross doesn't get to decide how I feel about you." Dylan's hands were still on her arms, his blue eyes intense in the kitchen light. "And he doesn't get to decide how you feel about me." The mention of Jonathan sent a spike of guilt through her chest. She'd seen the way he'd looked at them in the conference room, the carefully controlled jealousy behind his judicial mask. Jonathan had been patient for 6 years, never pushing, never making her feel pressured or uncomfortable. He deserved better than watching her fall for a client who might be a murderer. "This is complicated," she said finally. "Everything about this case is complicated." Dylan stepped back, giving her space. "But what I feel for you isn't complicated at all." Before she could respond, her phone rang. The caller ID showed Jonathan's personal number, which he'd never used to contact her before. "Judge Cross?" she answered, her voice slightly breathless. "Scarlett, I'm sorry to call so late, but I just received a call from the district attorney's office. They're planning to upgrade the charges against your client to first-degree murder." Jonathan's voice was carefully neutral. "The arraignment is scheduled for tomorrow morning." "On what basis?" Scarlett felt Dylan watching her, reading her expression. "New evidence. I can't discuss details, but I wanted you to know so you could prepare." Jonathan paused. "Scarlett, be careful. This case is attracting attention from people with serious resources and serious motives." After he hung up, Scarlett stared at her phone. Jonathan was warning her about something beyond normal prosecutorial tactics, something that had made him risk judicial ethics to call her directly. "What is it?" Dylan asked. "They're upgrading to murder one, which means they think they can prove premeditation." Scarlett set her phone on the counter. "And I think Judge Cross just warned me that someone very powerful wants you convicted." Dylan moved closer again, his hand touching her cheek. "Then we'd better find the real killer before they succeed." Scarlett leaned into his touch for just a moment before stepping away. Tomorrow she'd be in court defending a man she was falling in love with, facing a judge who'd been in love with her for years, while investigating the murder of her father. She'd handled complicated cases before, but never one where her heart was as much at risk as her client's life. Agent Rebecca Hayes was waiting in Scarlett's office when she arrived at 7 a.m. Friday morning. The FBI agent sat in the client chair with the controlled stillness of someone accustomed to delivering life-changing news. Dylan was nowhere to be seen. "Where's my client?" Scarlett asked, dropping her briefcase beside her desk. "Safe. We moved him to a federal facility overnight after someone tried to break into your house." Agent Hayes watched Scarlett's face carefully. "Ms. Meridian, there are things about your client's identity that you need to understand before today's arraignment." Scarlett felt her chest tighten. "What things?" Dylan Westbrook isn't just a witness in federal protection. His real name is Sebastian Cross. Agent Hayes paused, letting the surname register. "He's Judge Jonathan Cross's younger brother." The office seemed to tilt sideways. Scarlett gripped the edge of her desk, her mind racing through 8 years of professional interactions with Jonathan, searching for any hint that he had a brother. Jonathan had always seemed like a solitary man, focused entirely on his career, with no family connections or personal entanglements. That's impossible. Judge Cross would have recused himself from the case. Judge Cross believes his brother died 8 years ago in an explosion at a construction site in South Boston. Sebastian was working undercover for us, documenting mob connections to union corruption. When Vincent Torino's people got suspicious, we staged Sebastian's death to protect him. Agent Hayes pulled out a thick file. Jonathan Cross attended his brother's funeral. He has a headstone he visits every year on the anniversary. Scarlett sank into her chair, feeling the weight of deception settling around her. Every interaction with Dylan, every moment of growing attraction, had been built on lies. Worse, She'd been unknowingly manipulating a judge who was grieving his brother's death, while that same brother sat at her defense table. Why didn't Sebastian tell Jonathan the truth? Because Jonathan Cross is exactly the kind of honest judge who would have insisted on proper channels. He would have contacted the FBI, filed reports, followed protocol, all of which would have gotten Sebastian killed and potentially compromised other ongoing investigations. Agent Hayes leaned forward. Sebastian chose to let his brother mourn rather than risk his life. And now we have a problem. The physical evidence against Sebastian is overwhelming. His fingerprints on the murder weapon, his DNA under Victoria's fingernails from what the prosecution claims was a struggle. If he's convicted, his real identity will eventually surface during appeals or sentencing. When that happens, he's dead within a week. Scarlett's phone buzzed with a text from Dylan. Need to see you before court. There's more you don't know. 20 minutes later, she was sitting across from Sebastian Cross in a federal holding facility in downtown Boston. The resemblance to Jonathan was obvious now that she knew to look for it. The same strong jawline, the same intelligent eyes, though Sebastian's were blue where Jonathan's were brown. 8 years had changed him enough that the differences were more apparent than the similarities, but family traits were unmistakable. You lied to me about everything, she said without preamble. I lied about my name. Everything else was true. Sebastian's voice carried the weight of years of deception. I didn't kill Victoria. I loved her, and I've been in hell watching my brother preside over my case without being able to tell him I'm alive. Why didn't you trust me with the truth? Because I knew exactly what you're feeling right now. Betrayed, angry, questioning everything about our relationship. Sebastian met her eyes. I was going to tell you after the preliminary hearing, but then we found Victoria's evidence, and everything accelerated. Scarlett studied his face, looking for signs of the man she'd been falling in love with underneath the deception. Agent Hayes says the physical evidence is overwhelming. How do you explain your DNA under Victoria's fingernails? I can't. Tuesday morning, Victoria and I had breakfast together. Normal conversation, normal contact. If she had my DNA under her nails when she died, someone put it there. Sebastian's voice hardened. Someone who had access to both of us. Who would have that kind of access? Her family. The people running the money laundering operation your father died investigating. Sebastian reached across the table, but Scarlett pulled her hands back. Scarlett, think about the timing. Victoria discovers the financial records, starts building a case against her own family. Suddenly, she's being blackmailed, then murdered, and I'm perfectly framed with physical evidence that shouldn't exist. The pieces were falling into place in ways that made Scarlett's stomach twist. You think her family killed her to protect the laundering operation. I think Richard Sterling has been running drugs money through Sterling Pharmaceuticals for over a decade. Your father got close to exposing him 12 years ago and died for it. Victoria got close 8 days ago and died for it. Sebastian's voice dropped. And now you're getting close, which means you're next. Scarlett felt the truth of his words settling in her chest like lead. The break-in attempt at her house, the feeling of being watched, the sedan parked outside Victoria's brownstone. Someone was tracking her movements, waiting for the right moment to eliminate another threat to their operation. There's something else, Sebastian continued. Agent Hayes ran the DNA evidence through federal databases. The sample under Victoria's fingernails was degraded, like it had been stored improperly before being planted. Someone's been keeping biological samples from both of us. How is that possible? Victoria had regular medical exams at Sterling Family Clinics. I've been getting routine physical exams through Federal Protection Services. If someone in the Sterling organization had access to those medical records. Sebastian didn't need to finish the thought. Scarlett's phone rang. Jonathan's number appeared on the caller ID, and she felt her heart rate spike. How could she face him in court knowing that the defendant he was preparing to sentence was his supposedly dead brother? Judge Cross. Scarlett, we need to talk before the arraignment. My chambers, 8:30. Jonathan's voice was strained. And bring your client. There are questions about this case that need to be addressed immediately. After he hung up, Scarlett stared at Sebastian. He wants to see both of us in chambers. Do you think he knows? Jonathan's not stupid. If he's been studying the case files, he might have noticed things. Mannerisms, expressions. Sebastian stood, his hands shaking slightly. Scarlett, if he figures out who I am during the arraignment, if he has some kind of breakdown in open court. It will destroy his career and possibly get you killed. Scarlett gathered her files, feeling the weight of impossible choices. We have 30 minutes to figure out how to tell a judge that his dead brother is alive, in federal protection, and accused of murder. Sebastian moved closer, and for a moment she saw past the deception to the man who'd kissed her in her kitchen 12 hours ago. Whatever happens in that courtroom, I need you to know that everything I told you about my feelings was true. The only thing I lied about was my name. Scarlett wanted to believe him, but trust felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. In 20 minutes, she'd be walking into Jonathan Cross's chambers with the brother he'd been mourning for 8 years, hoping that family loyalty would overcome judicial duty. The alternative was watching Sebastian die in prison while the real killers continued laundering money through pharmaceutical companies and murdering anyone who got in their way. Jonathan's chambers felt smaller with 3 people in it. Sebastian sat rigidly in the chair farthest from the judge's desk, his face carefully neutral. Scarlett positioned herself between the 2 men, acutely aware of the family resemblance that seemed more obvious with each passing second. Jonathan studied the case file spread across his desk, his expression unreadable behind wire-rimmed glasses. When he finally looked up, his gaze went directly to Sebastian. "Mr. Westbrook, you served in the military before becoming an architect." "Yes, Your Honor. Army Corps of Engineers." Sebastian's voice was steady, but Scarlett caught the slight tension around his eyes. "Interesting specialty. My younger brother was also interested in engineering. Construction projects, specifically." Jonathan's tone remained conversational, but there was something else underneath. "He died in a construction accident 8 years ago." The silence stretched until Scarlett felt compelled to break it. "Your Honor, is there a specific legal matter you wanted to discuss?" Jonathan's attention shifted to her, and she saw something in his expression that made her stomach drop. Knowledge. Suspicion. The careful control of a man who suspected his world was about to shatter. "Ms. Meridian, how long have you known your client?" "We met 3 days ago when he retained my services." "And in those 3 days, have you developed any personal feelings that might compromise your professional judgment?" Jonathan's voice was deceptively calm, but Scarlett recognized the tone. She'd heard it in court when he was building toward a devastating cross-examination. "Your Honor, I'm not sure what you're implying." "I'm implying that you've been observed in circumstances that suggest a romantic relationship with your client. Leaving restaurants together, spending time at your residence." Jonathan stood, moving to the window that overlooked the courthouse square. "I'm concerned that your emotional investment may be affecting your legal strategy." Sebastian started to speak, but Scarlett cut him off with a look. This was about more than professional ethics. Jonathan was probing, testing, looking for confirmation of suspicions he couldn't quite voice. "Judge Cross, my personal life has never interfered with my professional responsibilities. Your personal life has never involved defending someone accused of first-degree murder." Jonathan turned back to face them, and Scarlett saw pain mixed with the judicial authority. "Ms. Meridian, I've known you for 6 years. I've watched you handle the most difficult cases with complete objectivity. But this case is different. You're different." The weight of unspoken history filled the room. 6 years of professional respect tinged with romantic possibility. 6 years of careful boundaries and mutual attraction neither of them had acted upon. Now Jonathan was watching her risk everything for a client she'd known for 3 days. "Your Honor, I request that you recuse yourself from this case," Scarlett said quietly. "On what grounds?" "Personal bias against the defendant based on your feelings for defense counsel." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "My personal feelings have never influenced my judicial decisions." "Then trust me to do my job." Scarlett met his eyes directly. "Whatever you think you see between my client and me, it won't affect my representation." A knock at the chamber door interrupted them. The court clerk entered with an apologetic expression. "Judge Cross, there's been a development. Richard Sterling is here with his attorney. He wants to address the court before the arraignment." Jonathan exchanged glances with Scarlett. Richard Sterling was Victoria's uncle, the man who controlled Sterling Pharmaceuticals' day-to-day operations. His appearance at the arraignment was unexpected and potentially significant. "Very well. We'll reconvene in chambers after I hear what Mr. Sterling has to say." Jonathan gathered his files. "Mr. Westbrook, Ms. Meridian, please don't discuss this conversation with anyone." 15 minutes later, they were back in the courtroom. Richard Sterling sat in the front row with his attorney, a man in his late 50s with silver hair and the predatory smile of someone who'd built a fortune through carefully calculated ruthlessness. When Jonathan called the court to order, Sterling's attorney immediately requested permission to address the court. "Your Honor, my client has information relevant to the charges against Mr. Westbrook. Information that may significantly impact the prosecution's case." Jonathan looked skeptical but nodded. "Proceed." Richard Sterling stood, his voice carrying easily through the packed courtroom. "Your Honor, I believe my niece was killed because she discovered something about Mr. Westbrook's past. Something that gave him compelling reason to silence her permanently." Scarlett felt her blood turn cold. Somehow, Richard Sterling knew about Sebastian's real identity. The question was how he'd learned it and what he planned to do with the information. "Mr. Sterling, if you have evidence of criminal activity, it should be presented through proper channels," Jonathan said carefully. "With respect, Your Honor, some evidence is too sensitive for normal procedures." Sterling's smile widened. "Dylan Westbrook is not who he claims to be. He's a federal witness living under an assumed identity, a man with compelling reasons to kill anyone who threatened to expose him." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Scarlett saw Dylan's face go pale, watched Jonathan's careful judicial mask slip for just a moment. Sterling was forcing the truth into the open in the worst possible way. "Mr. Sterling, these are serious allegations," Jonathan said, his voice cutting through the noise. "Do you have proof of these claims?" "I have documentation that Mr. Westbrook has been living under federal protection for 8 years. Documentation that shows his real identity." Sterling's attorney handed a folder to the bailiff. "I believe the court will find this information highly relevant to motive." Scarlett's mind raced through options, all of them bad. If Sebastian's real identity became public record, he'd be dead within days. But if she didn't act now, Richard Sterling would control the narrative and probably succeed in framing Sebastian for murder. She stood slowly, feeling the weight of impossible choices. "Your Honor, may I approach the bench?" Jonathan nodded, and Scarlett walked forward until she was close enough to speak without being overheard. Sebastian's life, Jonathan's emotional stability, and her own career all hung in the balance of the next few seconds. "Judge Cross," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Dylan Westbrook's real name is Sebastian Cross." Jonathan's face went completely white. His hands gripped the edge of the bench so tightly his knuckles showed, and for a moment Scarlett thought he might collapse. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "My brother is dead. Your brother has been in federal protection for 8 years. He let you believe he was dead to keep you safe." Scarlett glanced back at Sebastian, who was watching them with obvious terror. Richard Sterling killed Victoria because she discovered he was planning to eliminate Sebastian, the same way he killed my father 12 years ago. Jonathan's eyes moved to Sebastian, really seeing him for the first time. 8 years of changes, but underneath them, the brother he'd mourned. The brother he'd visited at a fake graveside every year. "Sebastian," Jonathan whispered, and the name carried 8 years of grief and disbelief. Behind them, Richard Sterling was still talking, spinning his version of events for the media-packed courtroom. But Scarlett could see the moment when Jonathan Cross, the grieving brother, overcame Jonathan Cross, the impartial judge. The trial of the heart had begun, and everything depended on which side of him would win. Jonathan declared a 2-hour recess and cleared the courtroom with the efficiency of a man in shock. Scarlett found herself in a federal conference room with Sebastian, Agent Hayes, and 3 U.S. Marshals. Jonathan had recused himself and was somewhere in the building trying to process 8 years of grief that had just been revealed as unnecessary. "Richard Sterling just made a critical mistake," Agent Hayes said, spreading documents across the conference table. "By publicly revealing Sebastian's protected status, he's committed a federal crime. More importantly, he's shown he has access to classified information that should have been impossible to obtain." Sebastian sat with his head in his hands. Jonathan looked at me like I was a ghost, like I'd betrayed him all over again. "You saved his life," Scarlett said, though her own feelings about his deception remained complicated. "Sterling's people would have killed him to get to you. Sterling's people have been planning this for months," Agent Hayes continued. "We've been monitoring his communications since Victoria's murder. He's been systematically eliminating everyone connected to the original money laundering investigation." Agent Hayes pulled out surveillance photos showing Richard Sterling meeting with men in expensive suits outside Sterling Pharmaceuticals corporate offices. Vincent Torino's nephew, Marcus Torino, current head of the family's financial operations. They've been using Sterling's European subsidiaries to clean money for 8 years, ever since the original investigation was shut down. Scarlett studied the photos, seeing her father's death in a new context. My father wasn't killed to stop an investigation. He was killed to protect an ongoing partnership. Exactly. And Victoria wasn't killed because she discovered the money laundering. She was killed because she figured out Richard was planning to eliminate Sebastian. Agent Hayes turned to another page in the file. Victoria had been researching Dylan Westbrook's background. She'd hired a private investigator who discovered discrepancies in his federal documentation. Sebastian looked up. She knew who I really was? She suspected. The private investigator's report shows she was planning to confront you the night she was killed. But first, she went to her Uncle Richard with questions about the family's business practices. Agent Hayes' expression darkened. Richard realized Victoria was connecting too many dots. So he killed her and framed you, knowing that your eventual conviction would expose your real identity and get you killed in prison. The conference room door opened and Jonathan entered, followed by Judge Helen Morrison, who would be taking over the case. Jonathan looked like he'd aged 5 years in 2 hours. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, and his judicial robes had been replaced by a simple suit. Sebastian. Jonathan's voice was rough with emotion. Sebastian stood slowly, 8 years of separation and deception hanging between them. Johnny, I'm sorry. I'm so goddamn sorry. Jonathan crossed the room in 3 steps and pulled his younger brother into an embrace that was part relief, part anger, and entirely genuine. Sebastian broke down completely, 8 years of isolation and fear pouring out in harsh sobs against his brother's shoulder. I thought you were dead, Jonathan whispered. I've been visiting your grave every year, bringing flowers, talking to a headstone. I wanted to tell you so many times, but they said it would put you in danger. Sebastian pulled back, wiping his eyes. I couldn't risk your life for my guilt. Scarlett watched the reunion with conflicted emotions. The love between the brothers was obvious, but she still felt manipulated by Sebastian's deception. Every conversation, every moment of growing attraction, had been built on lies he'd chosen to maintain even after she'd taken his case. Judge Morrison cleared her throat. Gentlemen, as touching as this reunion is, we have a murder case to resolve. Agent Hayes, what's the Bureau's position on proceeding with charges against Mr. Cross? We're dropping all cooperation with local authorities and taking this case federal. Richard Sterling is being arrested as we speak for conspiracy, murder, money laundering, and compromising federal witness protection. Agent Hayes gathered her files. Sebastian's testimony will be crucial for convicting not just Sterling, but the entire Torino organization. What about my father's case? Scarlett asked. Federal grand jury will be convened within 30 days. Thomas Meridian's murder will finally be prosecuted. Agent Hayes met Scarlett's eyes. Your father's work wasn't wasted. It's going to bring down one of the largest money laundering operations in New England. Judge Morrison stood. Mr. Cross, you're free to go. Ms. Meridian, the Commonwealth is dropping all charges. This case is officially closed. As the federal agents filed out, Scarlett found herself alone with the Cross brothers. Jonathan was studying Sebastian's face like he was memorizing every detail. 8 years of changes and similarities. You look different, Jonathan said finally. Older, more careful. Federal protection changes you. You learn to watch shadows, to never get too comfortable anywhere. Sebastian glanced at Scarlett. You learn that trusting people can get them killed. Is that why you didn't tell me? Scarlett asked. The hurt in her voice was obvious, and both brothers looked at her with varying degrees of concern. I told myself I was protecting you, but the truth is, I was protecting myself. Sebastian moved closer, but she stepped back. I've been Sebastian Cross pretending to be Dylan Westbrook for so long. I forgot how to just be honest with someone I cared about. Jonathan watched the exchange with the sharp attention of someone reading between lines. How long have you two been involved? We're not involved, Scarlett said quickly. We're complicated, Sebastian said at the same time. Jonathan's expression shifted to something that might have been amusement if the circumstances were different. Sebastian, You always did have terrible timing with women. Johnny, there's something else you should know. About Scarlett and me. Sebastian took a deep breath. I'm in love with her. Have been since the moment she agreed to take my case. Scarlett felt her cheeks burn. Sebastian, don't. No, you need to hear this. Both of you. Sebastian looked between his brother and the woman he was risking everything to defend. Jonathan, I know you have feelings for Scarlett. I've seen how you look at her in court, how careful you are to maintain professional distance. If I'd known, if I'd realized. You'd have what? Chosen a different attorney? Jonathan's voice was carefully neutral. I'd have told you the truth from the beginning. You deserve that. Sebastian met his brother's eyes. But I can't apologize for falling in love with her. The three of them stood in uncomfortable silence, years of history and complicated emotions filling the space between them. Finally, Jonathan spoke. Scarlett, what do you want? It was a simple question with no simple answer. She wanted justice for her father. She wanted Sebastian to be safe. She wanted to trust her own feelings instead of questioning every emotion. And somewhere in the tangle of professional ethics and personal desire, she wanted to forgive the man who'd lied to her in order to protect her. I want to go home and think, she said finally. This week has been too much to process all at once. Sebastian nodded, disappointment visible on his face. I understand. Sebastian, Jonathan said as they prepared to leave. You're staying in Boston? No more disappearing? No more disappearing. I want my life back. My real life, with my real name. Sebastian looked at Scarlett one last time. Whatever that ends up looking like. As they left the courthouse, Scarlett realized that for the first time in a week, Sebastian Cross was free to be exactly who he was. The question was whether she was brave enough to find out who that person really was. 6 months after Richard Sterling's arrest, Scarlett stood in her empty Willowbrook office, packing the last of her case files into bankers' boxes. The Sterling Pharmaceuticals investigation had dominated her life for months. Richard Sterling was facing federal charges for conspiracy, murder, and money laundering. Marcus Torino had been arrested in a coordinated FBI raid that dismantled most of his family's financial operations. Her father's case was finally getting the justice it deserved. Sebastian appeared in her doorway, carrying coffee and wearing jeans instead of the expensive suits Dylan Westbrook had favored. 6 months of living as himself had changed him in subtle ways. He moved with less caution, smiled more easily, and had reconnected with colleagues from his engineering days who'd thought he was dead. Last box? He asked, setting the coffee on her desk. Last box. Scarlett taped it shut and added it to the stack by the door. 15 years of criminal defense practice, reduced to 12 containers. Sebastian moved closer, and she didn't step away this time. They'd spent months rebuilding trust, having conversations that should have happened at the beginning instead of after his identity was revealed in federal court. Learning who Sebastian Cross really was underneath 8 years of careful deception had been like falling in love all over again, but more slowly, more carefully. Any regrets? He asked. About closing the practice? No. About taking a job teaching constitutional law at Boston University? Ask me after my first semester. Scarlett turned in his arms, enjoying the simple pleasure of being close to him without wondering what he was hiding. About you? Some days. Sebastian's smile faltered slightly. Some days I wonder what would have happened if you'd told me the truth from the beginning. Whether we'd have gotten here faster, or whether the deception was necessary for us to trust each other at all. Scarlett traced the line of his jaw with her finger. But most days, I'm just grateful you're alive and Richard Sterling is in federal prison. Most days is better than I hoped for 6 months ago. Sebastian caught her hand and pressed it against his cheek. Jonathan's meeting us at Harbor Point this afternoon. He'll be there, assuming he can get away from his new girlfriend long enough to drive to the coast. Scarlett grinned at Sebastian's surprised expression. You didn't know? Judge Helen Morrison. They've been dating for 3 months. Helen Morrison? The judge who took over my case? Sebastian laughed, the sound genuinely happy in a way that still surprised Scarlett sometimes. How did I miss that? You've been busy designing your first building in 8 years. And she makes him smile in ways I never saw before. Scarlett picked up her purse and headed for the door. Come on. We have a 2-hour drive, and you promised me dinner on the water. Harbor Point was a small coastal town north of Boston, the kind of place where tourists came for weekend getaways and locals made their living from fishing and summer rentals. Sebastian had bought a house there 3 months ago, a weathered colonial perched on bluffs overlooking the Atlantic. It was the first property he'd owned under his real name since entering witness protection. They arrived as the sun was setting, painting the water gold and orange. Jonathan's car was already in the driveway, and Scarlett could see him standing on the back deck with a woman who could only be Helen Morrison. Even from a distance, the easy intimacy between them was obvious. "They look happy," Sebastian observed as they walked up from the car. "They look like two people who figured out what they wanted and went after it." Scarlett squeezed his hand. Imagine that. Dinner was lobster rolls and white wine on the deck, the four of them talking easily about work, politics, and Jonathan's upcoming vacation to Ireland with Helen. The conversation had the comfortable rhythm of people who'd survived trauma together and come out closer on the other side. As the evening wound down, Sebastian stood and walked to the deck railing. "Before you two head back to Boston, there's something I need to do." He turned back to face them, and Scarlett felt her heart rate spike when she saw the small velvet box in his hands. "Sebastian," she started, but he shook his head. "Let me get this right for once." He dropped to one knee, and Scarlett heard Helen's sharp intake of breath. "Scarlett Meridian, 6 months ago you saved my life in ways that had nothing to do with legal representation. You taught me how to trust someone with the truth, even when that truth was complicated and painful." Jonathan and Helen had moved closer, creating an intimate circle on the deck overlooking the ocean. The sunset light caught the tears forming in Scarlett's eyes. "I know I lied to you about who I was, and I know that trust is something we're still rebuilding. But I also know that I want to spend the rest of my life proving that Sebastian Cross is someone worthy of your love." Sebastian opened the box, revealing a simple solitaire diamond that caught the last light of the sunset. "Will you marry me?" Scarlett looked down at him. This man who'd been willing to let his brother believe he was dead rather than risk his safety. Who'd spent 8 years in isolation to protect people he loved. Who'd chosen truth even when it meant facing a murder charge. "Yes," she said simply, "but I have conditions." Sebastian slipped the ring onto her finger, his hands shaking slightly. "Name them. No more lies. Ever. Even if you think the truth will hurt me." Scarlett pulled him to his feet. "And when we have children, they get to know their Uncle Jonathan from the beginning. Deal?" Sebastian kissed her, and Scarlett could taste salt air and promises on his lips. Jonathan cleared his throat behind them. "If you two are done being disgustingly romantic, I believe congratulations are in order." They turned to find Jonathan and Helen holding champagne glasses, apparently having anticipated this moment. To Sebastian and Scarlett, Jonathan raised his glass. To second chances and first loves, and the courage to trust in both. They drank as the last light faded over the water, and Scarlett realized that for the first time in months, she felt completely at peace. The Sterling case was closed. Her father's killers were facing justice, and she was marrying a man who'd learned to tell her the truth even when it was difficult. 3 months later, they were married in the small church in Harbor Point with Jonathan officiating and Helen standing as Scarlett's matron of honor. The ceremony was simple, attended by a handful of friends and colleagues who'd watched them navigate the complicated path from attorney-client privilege to genuine love. As Jonathan pronounced them husband and wife, Scarlett looked into Sebastian's blue eyes and saw not the desperate man who'd stumbled into her office 9 months ago, but the architect who was designing their future together. A future built on truth instead of deception, trust instead of fear. When Sebastian kissed her, she could hear the ocean beyond the church windows and feel the promise of all the years ahead of them. Years when Sebastian Cross would be exactly who he was, and Scarlett Cross would be exactly who she chose to be. 2 years later, she was grading constitutional law exams in the study of their Harbor Point house when Sebastian found her, holding an ultrasound photo and grinning like he'd just been given the best news of his life. "Boy or girl?" she asked, though she already knew from his expression. "Girl. Due in October." Sebastian sat beside her on the couch, pulling her close. "We're having a daughter, Mrs. Cross." Scarlett leaned into his warmth, watching the late afternoon sun stream through windows that faced the Atlantic. Their daughter would grow up knowing exactly who her parents were, where they came from, and how they'd found each other. She'd know her Uncle Jonathan and Aunt Helen, and she'd understand that love sometimes required patience, forgiveness, and the courage to trust in truth. It was more than Scarlett had ever dared to hope for, and exactly what Sebastian Cross deserved after 8 years of living someone else's life. Outside their windows, the ocean stretched endlessly toward the horizon, full of possibilities and promises they were finally free to keep.